Welcome, everybody. I'm Deborah Tomlinson with Inside the Vatican Pilgrimages, Inside the Vatican Magazine, and Urbi et Orbi Communications and Foundation. I hope that you're doing well today. We are very excited to bring you to Scotland today, and we're most excited because of our wonderful pilgrim leader. Father Sam, I believe you're here with us.
Yes, I am, Debbie. Good evening or good afternoon where you are, I suspect.
It's a good afternoon and good evening to you in Edinburgh, Scotland. Father Sam is the Catholic chaplain of the University of Edinburgh. So we are very grateful that he has offered to lead us on pilgrimage, and he's put a lot of preparation into the pilgrimage he's going to lead us on. I do want to share with everybody how we got to know Father Sam. Bob and I were on pilgrimage in Oxford, England. And for those of you who have been on pilgrimage with us before, you know that we meet a lot of people along the way, people who are expected to meet and unexpected. And at the time, Brother Sam was one of those unexpected encounters that we had along the way. And we had an encounter we were in Oxford and we were walking out of, is Bob on the foot? Where?
Blackfriars Chapel.
That's right. And we started engaging in a conversation with him. And we were so intrigued that we asked if he would partake with us on pilgrimage, and we would come back to see him, and you delivered a talk for us. Is that correct?
That's right.
And we have stayed in touch these years and have been together in Rome since then. And of course, last June, Brother Sam became Father Sam. So we're just honored that he has time in his busy schedule to help us here. And Robert, I turn it to you right now before we turn it over to Father Sam.
Well, it's really special to have an intellect and a spirit like Father Sam. He's Oxford educated, and he's also experienced in British government, because before he went into the Dominican order, he was one of the leading young aides in Parliament. And so he knows the ins and outs of British politics. Then he was attracted by the clarity and spirituality of Thomas Aquinas and the Dominican order, St. Dominic. And against the trends of our time, he is standing for eternal truth. He's a marvelous example of Britain and Scotland. And I think it's the greatest privilege to be on a trip with him today.
Yes.
Thank you, Robert and Deborah. I feel sure only now to disappoint. If I might, I want to just start off by saying a couple of things. The first is that the United States and Americans have been at the forefront of my prayers today. And earlier this evening, I offered Mass for that intention. That's not to say anything remotely about my politics, but this is a time that I think people everywhere should pray for America and for its future. So I wanted to assure you that I'm doing that, and many others in this country and throughout the world as well. It's a big day for America. The second thing to say, hopefully not too much against the spirit of the remarks that have already been made, is that by way of disclaimer, I'm not a historian and I'm not even Scottish, but I was a lawyer, hence the disclaimer. And I come to topics like this as a lawyer would a brief, and just try to find out as much as I can and read everything I can and try to make some sense of it. So I hope you'll forgive any mistakes, infelicities, technological errors. It's not my forte either, particularly. There's a lot of material that I put together, but hopefully we'll work our way through it in a relatively light fashion. Don't want it to feel too heavy. Screen time is innovating, and I'm so grateful for your attention and the opportunity to share with you some of the things I've learnt about the remarkable saint, Saint Margaret of Scotland, and to take you with me on a journey. So, could we go to the first slide?
Deb?
Yes.
Okay, we start here in Rome and the tomb of St. Peter, the Basilica of St. Peter. How are we going to get to Scotland?
Well, we're going to show you in just a moment. Are you seeing the screen?
Yep.
I'm seeing the first slide with the bridge.
Oh, you're not seeing, it hasn't moved?
Not for me.
Oh, I thought you'd been looking at it. I apologize. Let me see what's going on.
Now we see you again.
Oh.
I have it. If you want to make me, if you want to allow me to share screen, it might be easier if I just.
Would you prefer?
If you're able to do it.
Okay, I'll do that.
No, you can do it, Deb. I see now your screen is there with all the things on the side.
Okay.
Ah.
Okay, this is the first slide. So, friends, let's begin in earnest. Before we start, I want to step back and just pause for a moment to consider in broad strokes the person in whose footsteps we shall be walking. Saint Margaret of Scotland. The popular image of medieval saints like Saint Margaret often tells us only part of the story. Sometimes that's because of the passage of time and the lack of evidence available. And we're going to be dealing with a saint who died in the 11th century. But it's sometimes due to a lack of effort. The effort is, however, worthwhile, because what is revealed through a closer analysis is more complex, but infinitely more interesting. It's the thing that gives color to an otherwise rather monochrome story. So in the short time that we have together, I would like us to come to an appreciation of the richness of Margaret's life. I'd like us to go beyond the superficial Wikipedia account, and as much as is possible to try to understand this woman who became a queen, who started life as a refugee, who was a powerful ruler yet served the poor, and whose remarkable life and story has the capacity to inspire us today, to say nothing of her prayerful intercession. And so we'll do this by attempting to retrace some of her steps, to go to the places she visited, to encounter the people she knew, to survey a remarkable life. Here's one of the many images on this title page of St. Margaret, and it's an important one. It's taken from St. Margaret's Chapel in Edinburgh, where we'll visit later on our pilgrimage. This is perhaps the popular image of the saint, wearing blue for Scotland. Scotland indeed features in her title to distinguish her from the other St. Margarets. St. Margaret of Antioch, for example, a Greek martyr of the 4th century. St. Margaret of Cortona, 13th century Italian. Or perhaps one of my personal favorites, St. Margaret Clitheroe, an English martyr of the Reformation. Next slide. So this is our destination, Scotland. An image with the map to help you locate where it is. Scotland, as you know, is a country in what is now the United Kingdom. But before 1707, it was a separate kingdom. More recently, Robert mentioned my political involvement. Since 1998, it's been given some of its own powers. And so it's become a little bit akin to an American state within the United States. But rather than a federal system, it's an arrangement that we call devolution. Some power is devolved to Scotland. But it's still part of the United Kingdom for the moment. There are increasing moves, as you probably know, for Scottish independence, something that we can perhaps talk about later. Up until not very long ago, however, Scotland was sometimes referred to in things like postal addresses and even in conversation as North Britain. And it's a great way to irritate the Scots up here, I found, to use that term. To describe Scotland as North Britain is not something that many people up here enjoy, but I sometimes do, just to be provocative. So next slide, please. The first thing that I want to say is that St. Margaret of Scotland, I've mentioned Scotland twice already, could be something of a misnomer. You click again, Debbie? I think it's the only one that I've done that is sort of animation. I was experimenting. This is the height of my technological capacity. Because even though her title is St. Margaret of Scotland, as a matter of fact, she was an English princess by her father. Click again. She was born in Hungary, but a woman who eventually became a Queen of Scotland and ascended the royal throne. Now, one could perhaps be forgiven for thinking it sounds like the start of a bad joke. An English princess born in Hungary who ascends the throne of Scotland. But actually it reflects something of the political turbulence of the early medieval era in which we are working and in which Margaret lived. My point here is that the person whom we know as St. Margaret of Scotland was English by parentage, Hungarian by birth, and Scottish only by adoption, and even then, only as an adult. She was then, by the standards of the day, and even by our own standards, a rather cosmopolitan woman, a woman of the world. Next slide. So let's just have an overview of where we'll be going and what kind of things we're going to be looking at. So this is a sort of brief outline of some of the topics that we'll be covering, some of the places we'll see. There are three main parts. First, we're going to look at the English and Hungarian background, to which I've already alluded. This will be our homework, if you like, the kind of research that you have to do before heading out on a trip. So before we go to Scotland, we'll be going to some other places in Europe. Second, we'll put on our shoes and hit the road, visiting some important places in St. Margaret's life. And finally, the third part, we'll look at her death, legacy, and sainthood, asking what memories from the trip endure and what they might mean for us today. Time is short, so at the risk of mixing metaphors, fasten your seatbelts. So background. The homework that we have to do. Next slide. So I said that Mary was an English princess. This is a look at her family. This is a snapshot of the family tree of the kings of England, a rather old one at that. And for many of the images, particularly the interesting ones, I put in italics underneath what they are and where they're from, references so that you can look them up and take greater care over them if you like in your own time. This, as it says at the bottom, is a fragment of a larger ancient manuscript housed at the British Library in London and dates from the early 14th century. So over 300 years after the fact of Mary's birth. And this particular segment is known as Membrane 4. And it shows, if you can see, I don't know if you can magnify it on your screens or adjust the Zoom settings so that you can see the slides more closely. But it shows on close view 6 roundels. Edmund II, Edmund Ironside at the very top. He was a man who ruled England as king for just 5 months. And then his descendants, Edward, Atheling, Edgar, Margaret, Edmund, and Christine. Christine is the nun, black and white figure with a blue, very striking blue roundel in the bottom right-hand corner. And these illuminated manuscripts are beautiful, but in Latin and not the easiest to follow. So, nice as they are, perhaps we might move to a modern equivalent. Next slide, please. This is a more familiar kind of family tree. And here we see a broader portion of the kings and queens of England. And you see we've got Edward the Martyr. He was murdered at the age of about 15 years old, didn't have an heir. So the crown passed to his younger half-brother, Ethelred II, also known as Ethelred the Unready. Unready, not in the modern sense, but unready in an Old English sense, unread, which means poorly advised. Ethelred the Badly Advised. The pun on his name, as a matter of fact, because Ethelred means well advised, apparently. That's what passes for a medieval joke. Now, he was Margaret's great-grandfather. Then the crown passed to Edmund Ironside. Now, we saw him in the last slide, also known as Edmund II, reigned for 5 months. His son is really where our story begins properly, with Edward the Exile, sometimes known as Edward Atheling. He was born in 1016 and died in 1057. He was Margaret's father. Next slide. But Edward the Exile never became king, rather tragically. The clue as to why that is so is found in his name, his moniker. So let's look at his story a little more closely. And here we have a map of Europe, and we've got a fair bit of traveling to do before we get to Scotland, I'm sorry to say. We'll call this a preliminary detour. The story of Edward really begins after the Danish conquest of England in 1016. King Canute came to the throne, and Edward and his brother Edmund were sent to the Swedish court. So you see them move from figure 1 to figure 2. The Swedish court of Olof Skotkonung. He was King Canute's half-brother, or his stepbrother, some say, supposedly with instructions to have the children murdered. But Olof, the king's half-brother in Sweden, was an old ally of Ethelred the Unready, the prince's grandfather. So instead, disobeying his half-brother, he sent the Athelings to the Hungarian court of King Istvan, who we know today as Saint Stephen. And so the voyage you see from figure 2 to figure 3 in Hungary was undertaken by these young boys. And with King Stephen was his queen, Queen Gisela of Bavaria. Now, it's a very pious court. Hungary had been newly converted to Christianity, and Saint Stephen becomes a saint, as I say. But in 1028, when the boys were 12 years old, King Canute sent assassins. He found out that they were no longer in Sweden, so he sent assassins to Hungary to have them murdered. Why? Because they were the rightful heirs to the throne. They presented him with a threat. So hearing of this, King Stephen sent the princes to Gardarica, what we now call Kiev, figure 4, Ukraine, to the court of Yaroslav the Wise, Grand Prince of Kiev, where they could be protected and educated. Eventually, it was safe for them to return to Hungary. So Edward does that and marries Agatha. And we don't know a lot about Agatha, who is Margaret's mother, but she's thought to be a Hungarian princess. Background somewhat disputed. Next slide. They were given an estate in Hungary in the middle of what is now the south of Hungary. And this, by tradition, corroborated by a document, is where their castle was on the map. Next slide. Called Rika Castle or Reka Castle. I'm not entirely sure the correct pronunciation of that. Hungarian is a very difficult language. Back a slide. This is the estate that they were given. Is now a forest, and it's a hilltop area where a castle once stood, thought to be Frankish from the 9th century or earlier. Next slide. And the circumstances of its destruction are unknown, but is now marked by the cross that you can see and by various signs in the forest. The castle was probably, we don't know, but probably burnt down by the Turkish invasion in a conquest in the 16th and 17th century. Just as well you might think they didn't get to Vienna. Next slide. And so we can see this is still the same site, the Rika Castle, that it's a place that's visited, a place of devotion. And it's thought to have been the location for our subject, Margaret's birth, around the year 1046, so the midway through the 11th century. And there in Hungary, she grew up until she was aged 10. And at that point, the King of England, no longer Canute, but now restored to the English kings, Edward the Confessor, discovered about the existence of a cousin, also called Edward, who was smuggled away first to Sweden and then to Hungary, and still lived. And so he sent emissaries to bring him back because he needed an heir. He had no children that could ascend the throne. So off, he sends a bishop, as a matter of fact, off the bishop goes to collect Edward the Exile. Let's look at that Wessex family tree once again. You see Edward the Confessor on the right-hand side in the middle. And he was the half-uncle of Edward the Exile. Notice no issue, no heirs coming from him. And so Edward the Exile was offered the opportunity of an undisputed succession to the English throne. But in order to do that, of course, he has to make the journey. So here we see the voyage back to point 6 in England. And this is a journey, of course, not just that Edward undertakes, but also Margaret and her siblings and her mother, Agatha. Epic journey across some 1,200 miles of Europe. And they undertook that journey in April 1057. And they eventually returned to England, the place of Edward's birth, the kingdom that his father had ruled for just 5 months and which his uncle was now king. But tragically, he died within a few days of arrival in London without ever having met his uncle, Edmund the Confessor, the king. So there's naturally speculation as to whether this death of Edward the Exile, as soon as he returned as the heir apparent, was natural or was somehow from more sinister causes, perhaps being poisoned, for example. In any event, he was buried in Old St. Paul's Cathedral. Next slide. This is a 17th century, so much later, but an etching of Old St. Paul's from the Thames. I'm using the term old to make careful distinction from the building as was and the building that we now see in the same site, which is the church by Sir Christopher Wren, very neoclassical building that replaced it. But what a tragedy this must have been for the young Margaret, to think not only was that the trauma of a young girl, 10 years old, losing her father, but also the future dreams of a life ahead of her crushed, and the immediate insecurity of a family without a head and protector in an age of great brutality. How she must have prayed. Next slide. This is her brother, Edgar Atheling. With her father dead, it was her brother who seemed to be the obvious heir apparent. And for the next 9 years, Margaret resided at the English court, and her brother considered the future successor to the English throne. Margaret lived at the English court a very strict and religious life with her sister Christina, and much of their time was spent in meditation and prayer. Like all royal princesses, Margaret was well educated, and it was said that she could read Latin and speak French. When Edward the Confessor died, this is 9 years later after Edward the Exile's death, on the 5th of January 1066, he still died without an heir. Now the Witan, that is a council made up of the most powerful men in England, like a forerunner of Parliament or a Senate, a council of elders, if you like, made up of the most powerful men. They looked to, they were deliberated upon who should succeed the throne. And they decided that the one blood claimant, the one heir, Edgar, whom we see here, was simply too young, too inexperienced, not up to the challenges of the kingdom. And they instead nominated Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, a proven leader, a successful war record, and popular among the people. He also, even though he wasn't a blood relative, was Edward's brother-in-law, so it was a relation by marriage. So the following day after Edward the Confessor's death, they buried the man whom we now hold as a saint on the Feast of the Epiphany, buried him in the morning, and in the afternoon crowned Harold, proclaimed King of England. Next slide. But disaster struck with the Norman conquest. William the Conqueror comes, sensing weakness in September, seizes the opportunity and meets Harold and the English army in a decisive battle of Hastings on the 14th of October. After 9 hours of hard fighting, Harold was killed and his forces defeated. It was at this moment that you can see in the Bayeux Tapestry, very famous pictorial chronicle of the time, especially regarding the Battle of Hastings, that you see Harold getting hit in the eye. So all three figures are Harold. It's a kind of medieval animation. Gets hit in the eye with an arrow, falls over his horse and down to the ground. And so with Harold, then we have a bit of a false start in the continuity of the Saxon monarchy. But hope was not lost. Back to Edgar. Could he have been overlooked too quickly? He was the only choice remaining. And so the Witan assembled again this council in London and elected that Edgar, Margaret's brother, should be king, But William's strength proved too great. In early December, the remaining members of the Wheaton in London met, and they resolved effectively to surrender. And they took the young uncrowned king out to meet William and to submit to him, quietly setting aside the election that they had had. And Edgar, along with all of the other English lords, pay homage to the new King William at the coronation in December that same eventful year. And it sounds like I'm making great hay of this year 1066. It's because it was a very important year in English history. And there's a very funny schoolboy book, which is a kind of tongue-in-cheek summary of English history by two men, Sellers and Yates, called 1066 and All That. And a lot happened in 1066. So here we have a map. Now, the next moves are a little bit uncertain. Legend has it that Edgar fled north, but history reveals that Edgar actually stayed in London, close to William, before going on to Normandy in France for 2 years. And he only fled north when rebellion was in the air. Now, it's assumed, although we don't know for sure, that Margaret followed him, that they stayed together as a family and all did the same. Whatever happened, wherever they went, they all ended up in Northumbria. Now, Northumbria, you can see from the map, is in the far north of England, but not yet quite in Scotland. And it was up there in the northeast of England that they had been raising an army, trying to get together enough support to defeat William in London. But William tried to stop them. In an assault now known as the Harrying of the North, he took lots of troops up there, and Edgar and the family fled. Now you see here that they fled, the story goes, in a boat heading towards the continent, probably back to Hungary, fleeing William. And that their ship was caught and blown off course in a storm, such that with the weather against them, they landed in Scotland in Fife to take refuge at the court of Malcolm III. I'm sorry about the schoolboy illustrations here. I think the men can probably sleep easy. But there you see their route. They went by boat north to Scotland. Next one. And this is a closer map of a body of water known as the Firth of Forth, which is effectively the main estuary out of Scotland on the east side. And it was through the Firth of Forth that they reached land. Now, I put on this this map the border, the modern border between Scotland and England, the modern border just north of Edinburgh. You probably see it's a faint dotted line. Take some caution with that border, because actually at the time it was very different. Hadrian's Wall is the traditional border that the Romans put up, is some way south of here. Next slide. And so we finally get to the arrival of the English Princess Margaret in Scotland. And the place of her first landing in Scotland is known as St. Margaret's Hope. A wonderful name for a place. St. Margaret's Hope. What hope must have been in her heart when she got to Scotland, fearing William's advances. And that's near a village known as North Queensferry, where we'll visit shortly, and stands directly across the river, the Firth of Forth, is Port Edgar. Port Edgar, named for her brother, who, as we know, was with her. They were together as a family. And so I put on the map there some of the exact locations. Where you see the blue marker, that is St. Margaret's Hope, where Margaret's boat landed. And you see in the painting King Malcolm coming to greet her as she gets off the ship. Now, there's a bit of an interesting personal note here that where St. Margaret's Hope is in fact the location of my Navy base. because in addition to being a Catholic chaplain here at the university, I'm also a chaplain in the Royal Navy as a reservist. And so this now forms part of where I train as a Navy chaplain. And the port is called Rosyth. So it's a naval base. And up until throughout both Second World Wars, it was where the Commander-in-Chief of Scotland resided. His house was where that blue marker is, St. Margaret's Hope. Now, I've spent some time emphasizing, I know, the dynastic background and the political situation, but I make no apology for that. It's important for us to understand how Margaret arrives in Scotland, in what state, and with what baggage, if you will. She was a princess, though dispossessed of any land or wealth. She was penniless, but educated. And though she held great promise, her immediate future was perilous. Perhaps as an analogy with how so many people stepped off boats when they arrived in your country, in the United States. I don't know, something to think about. Next slide.
It's stuck. Just one moment.
Okay. I'll carry on to.
Someone needs to admit Susan Clark and then Mary, and then it will allow me to do it.
I already admitted Susan Clark. She's still joining.
Okay.
Okay.
There we go.
Back one. I think we went forward two then.
Right.
So I just want, don't worry, we'll go with this one. So here we have an image of Malcolm, this king, who, this image comes from the National Portrait Gallery in Scotland. It's part of a remarkable series of portraits, actually, a processional frieze along, I put it there actually so you can get a sense of the whole of it, along the first floor balustrade. Depicts many famous Scots in reverse chronological order, reverse going back from Thomas Carlyle. It was designed as a kind of visual encyclopedia. Includes people like Robert Burns, Adam Smith, David Hume, and many saints and monarchs. And this is Malcolm Canmore in the lineup. Now, I'm calling him Malcolm Canmore. Some people call him King Malcolm III. Canmore is a Gaelic word meaning either big head or great chief. So you can take your pick, whether it's an anatomical descriptor or a salutation of authority, a kind of Hail Malcolm, big chief. He certainly seems to have taken a shine to Margaret very early on. He, like Margaret, had spent her early years at the English court, where when his father Duncan was overthrown by Macbeth, a name that you'll no doubt recognize from Shakespeare fame. Macbeth was Lord of Moray and deposed Malcolm's father, before Malcolm then, with English support, took the throne of Scotland back. It's not known, we don't know, if Malcolm and Margaret knew one another at the English court. Malcolm, after all, was 16 years older than Margaret. And so at the time of their meeting, Malcolm was 40, Margaret was about 24. About this time, Malcolm's first wife, Ingeborg, died. Now, whether she just disappeared, whether she died of natural causes, again, it's not known. Some people have speculated that it's a bit convenient. And he had two sons by her, Donald and Duncan, both of whom eventually become King of Scotland. And since Margaret was a woman of striking beauty, tall with blue eyes and fair hair, Malcolm was head over heels with the young Margaret. But it was also a marriage that made good political sense because he absorbed the disaffected English to his side, which would be of help in raising protection should William the Conqueror ever come knocking on the door of Scotland, or indeed whether Malcolm fancied greater lands in the north of England. This is an etching of him that you can see. Malcolm, it seems, was not known for his good looks, But he had one big advantage in trying to woo the young Margaret, which was that he spoke English. Remember I said he'd been at the English court. And Margaret, for her part, couldn't speak the native language of Gaelic. So she was at a great disadvantage in her new surroundings. She didn't speak the language, and the one person who could was Malcolm. So he did a lot of the interpreting for her. Now, Margaret is said to have resisted his advances and proposals of marriage because apparently she preferred, according to one account, a life of piety. She was going to take the veil and retreat to a convent, as in fact her sister Christina did. But Malcolm was a persistent man, and Margaret was in a very vulnerable position. And so the couple finally married at Dunfermline in the Culdee, or the Celtic church, in 1069, maybe 1070. Now this church was later to become Dunfermline Abbey, which we'll visit shortly. And at that marriage, she became Queen of Scotland. And one of her chroniclers, Turgot, we'll come up to him in a moment, he writes that the Queen married, quote, not because of the honor of the world delighted her, but because she felt compelled to do that which royal estate demanded of her. In other words, duty was her motive, a sense of duty. Next slide. Now, this is the wedding in art form. These illustrations are taken from the Lonsdale frieze, so-called, in a magnificent Gothic house, Mount Stuart, on the Isle of Bute, an island off the west coast of Scotland. They were commissioned by John Crichton Stuart, the third Marquess, a nobleman in the 19th century. And we're going to be seeing a lot of these paintings because they're one of the best depictions that we have. So if you, they're painted by H.W. Lonsdale, and I put here just to show you, next slide, yeah. And again, yeah. I put here just to show you his house. Mount Stuart is the big neo-Gothic house. That gentleman is John Crichton Stuart, the third Marquess. And then this is the bedroom, would you believe, in which all of the paintings, like the last one, are to be found. So they're all wallpaper in a bedroom, effectively. But we're going to be seeing a lot of them, so I thought I'd just show you that. Okay. Queen of Scotland, Part 2. Unfortunately, much more is known about Margaret's life after she arrived in Scotland. And this is thanks to an account written 20 years after her death by her confessor, confidant, and friend, Turgot. And here we meet Turgot. Turgot was prior of Durham, comes from Durham originally, and that is Durham Cathedral you can see, and you can even see his name as one of the early priors in the cathedral. I put that just above, and his portrait on the left. He later became, after being prior of Durham, Bishop of St. Andrews. And he wrote the great life of Margaret, the Vita Margaritae. And that was at the request of Margaret's daughter, Queen Matilda, after Margaret's death sometime between 1100 and 1107. His biography portrays a determined, strong, and pious woman who, although stern, had a great devotion to performing spiritual and charitable works, as well as a keen interest in reforming the church in Scotland. And from here on in our pilgrimage, I will be not so much looking at her life chronologically, as we've done, but rather thematically. And I'm going to be relying to a great extent upon Turgot's biography. I'll try my best to connect the themes with places that we can visit or tangible objects that we can see. Next slide. So we start in Dunfermline, Dunfermline was then the capital city, not Edinburgh. That's the first thing to bear in mind. When Margaret first arrived in Scotland, bear in mind she's been in Hungary, England, maybe even France, she was not impressed with the way the church was run and organized. There were no monastic orders, and instead it was Celtic spirituality that was dominant. And this was, although very distinguished in certain ways, utterly cut off from Rome. All of the developments in the church that had taken place were basically unknown and certainly not followed in Scotland and in Ireland and all of the various smaller islands off the coasts of both of those places. And so everything that she knew about liturgy and devotion was just unheard of in Scotland. And so she set about trying to bring Scotland more into line with England, Hungary, and Christendom, or Europe at large. So the first thing that she did was to bring the monks over. So she brought monks of St. Benedict, Benedictines, by asking her friend, the Archbishop of Canterbury, an archbishop called Lanfranc, to send 3 monks. And they came up to found a priory at Dunfermline, in this capital city where she lived, and to found a new priory, new monastic establishment at that same church in which she'd got married. She's changing it from Celtic to Benedictine. But Margaret was not opposed to indigenous Celtic monasticism as such. Rather, she supported at least 2 Celtic communities, one at Lochleven and one at Abergavenny. And she rebuilt Iona. We'll go there shortly. She seems to have enjoyed visiting many Celtic hermits, asking for prayers and giving alms. Margaret was concerned that the church in Scotland needed to reform, needed to become more Roman, but she still respected the very genuine form of spirituality that she encountered. She wanted to take people with her in her reforms rather than provoke opposition. And here we see her, as it were, holding court in ecclesiastical matters. Turgot writes this about what she did. Many abuses which had grown up contrary to the rule of faith and the institutions and observances of the church, she succeeded in condemning and expelling from the kingdom. He further notes how through her work, she involved her husband, King Malcolm, to be her interpreter, because as I've said already, she didn't speak Gaelic. So what kind of things are we talking about? Well, for example, she wanted to establish uniformity in the way Lent was observed. She wanted Lent to begin on Ash Wednesday. The Scots had fallen into a practice, believe it or not, of starting Lent 10 days into what we would count as Lent, much later. It was following Monday it was the Scots started. And she wanted Sunday to be a day of rest. She put prohibitions on marriage with one's stepmother or with a brother's widow. And she wanted Mass to stop being celebrated in what Turgot calls a barbarous rite. Mass was not being said well, though that could just be that she didn't like the language and she wanted Mass to be said in Latin. We don't know, but she's trying to get consistency. Next slide. Yeah. So religious reform. As benefactress, she improved the quality of vessels and vestments. She gave money to buy the best liturgical equipment. And she also wanted Dunfermline to be a religious centre, place of royal burial, a sort of Scottish equivalent of Westminster Abbey. And in this, she was successful, because the site houses the tombs of 22 Scottish kings and queens, including people like Robert the Bruce. Next slide. Dunfermline was where she lived and where she prayed. Here we have a remarkable place, the entrance to St. Margaret's Cave. She rose at midnight every night to attend the night liturgy, the prayers of the hours. Outside of her royal duties, much of her day was spent in prayer, and she periodically withdrew to a secret cave that we see here, where she worshipped in private. It's called St. Margaret's Cave. Now, bizarrely, it is situated underneath a municipal car park. And happily, it's preserved underground and is open to the public. Here you see the entrance down into the cave and a statue of Margaret as she might have been praying in the cave. I have to confess that I've not been when I tried to go. Sadly, it was closed. And I've not had the chance to go back. But there we have it. St. Margaret was a lover of books, unsurprisingly, given her religious commitments. Here is St. Margaret's Gospel book, currently housed in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And in fact, I think Deborah and Robert went there on the visit when I met them in Oxford. It shows us a compact selection of passages from Gospels in Latin with very beautiful illuminations, as they call them, illustrations, as we might say. Now, it was made in England around 1025, so she may have probably picked it up when she was at the English court. It was later owned by Margaret, and said to have been her favorite book, one that she read and studied closely, even when she traveled. And it was certainly small enough for her to take with her on her various royal processions. The book gives us a clue to her piety. On the first page, there's a hexameter poem that was added at the front of the book. And it describes how the book was dropped into a Scottish river for several hours and remained undamaged. It's a story of a miracle helped to contribute to her reputation for holiness. And a miracle that's also recorded independently in Turgot's biography. And you can see at the bottom of the image, the Bodleian Library shelf mark, MS Lat Liturg, folio 5. Now, the poem is also key to the book's identification. After Margaret's death, the book passed through many different people's hands, gradually becoming completely disassociated with its original owner, so that by the 19th century, when the book arrived at the Bodleian Library, having been bought cheaply at auction, nobody knew what the book was exactly. And in fact, they wrongly dated it to the 14th century. But in 1887, a young 22-year-old scholar by the name of Lucy Hill, in 1887, she would have been one of the very early female students at Oxford University. Was 22 years old, one of the first women to attend university. She was looking at the book, studied the poem, and it dawned on her who the original owner was. I think because she knew the Turgot account. And she attributed the book to having been St. Margaret's. And there's another Psalter held at Edinburgh University where I am, which is thought to have been hers. But this is the real Eureka great find. Here we have just some iconography, I suppose, some symbology, which is interesting. I've put into the slide here the coats of arms. And you can see that Margaret has the arms of her uncle, Edward the Confessor, the blue background and the white cross. She's very much trying to assert her royal credentials and perhaps also something of her piety. Edward the Confessor was a saintly king, he was canonized. And so she is trying to show her association with him front and center. Margaret, in putting these two together like this, it shows that she was quite a hands-on queen. It's not so much consort queen, although certainly she was that, but even something more akin to co-regent. she was quite happy to exercise authority. And in that endeavor, of course, she needed the authority of her husband, the king. And she was a huge influence upon him, it would seem. Here she is with Malcolm. Now, Malcolm was said to be illiterate. And so she would show him the prayer books that she loved. He would patiently study and would pay for them to be lavishly decorated and to put gold and illustrations in them. Reading between the lines of Turgot's account, one rather gets the impression that she would read to him whilst he enjoyed looking at the pictures. But that's just my supposition, I think. The overwhelming sense from Turgot is that Margaret was a civilizing influence upon her brutish, slightly more warmongering Scottish husband. And this came principally not from her intellect, though she had a considerable intellect, but from her faith. Turgot notes that Malcolm, quotes, saw that Christ truly dwelt in her heart. What she rejected, he rejected. What she loved, he, for love of her, loved too. So it was an infectious faith as much a bossy intellect. And much might be said of her children. She was a great influence upon them too. And she had in all 8 children, would you believe? And she passed on to them study and the love of books. 6 sons and 2 daughters. It's interesting to note, looking at those names, that none of the children were given Scottish names. She seems keen to preserve something of their English ancestry. Edward, well, we've already met 2 Edwards. Edmund, we've met one of those as well in the English royal family. Ethelred, how English can you get? He was made Abbot of Dunkeld, goes into the church. Edgar, same name as a brother. Alexander, Edith, later called Matilda. She's very important in the history of England. Mary, she goes to France, well, what is now France. And David, we'll come back to David, he was the youngest. Next slide. One of the things that Margaret is known for above almost all other things is her care for the poor. She devoted herself to alleviating the hardship of those less fortunate than herself. She's said to have cared for 24 people on a constant basis, giving them food and shelter, and generally giving them what we would call welfare support and cover in all respects. But she also ministered to the poor, a great larger number of poor people, during the seasons of Lent and Advent. She's said to have fed 300 persons each day, serving them personally whilst she herself fasted. It wasn't enough for her to give money and give alms. She had to be the person ministering the charity. I think that's very significant and chimes very strongly with some of the themes of Pope Francis in terms of there's a transformation to be had when we ourselves are involved in the work of charity. Continuing the theme of the poor, there are Robin Hood-like stories of her involved in, quote, pious theft, where she would take from the king's treasury and from the king's possessions and give them to the poor. Now, the circumstances of this are not entirely certain. It's mentioned by Turgot. And it's possible that the king secretly approved and turned a blind eye, or that this was one big joke, a bit of a pantomime kind of banter between them. Because Turgot says that Malcolm would bring Margaret to him, quote, for judgment, saying in jest that she was a thief. So he probably went, oh, she's stealing my money again from me, Father. Come on. It's that kind of arrangement. Now let's remember that serving the poor in this way was simply not the done thing for a medieval queen. However, there is an earlier biblical model for servant queenship in the figure of Esther. And Turgot seems to liken Margaret to a kind of second Esther when he writes, quote, "In the midst of her exalted dignity, she took very great care to preserve lowliness of mind." That's what we'd now call, I think, humility. She skillfully interweaved her royal dignity with a care and a love for the most needy. One aspect serves to enhance the other. Next slide. Also in Dunfermline, this city, we see commerce and culture. So she was very much the kind of cosmopolitan woman. I've used that word again. I don't mean in the sense of the magazine, by the way, but she changed fashion, manners. She introduced luxury goods like clothing in new cuts and completely new colors, unseen before because of dyes that were only available on the continent. Ornaments and vessels for serving food and drink. She brought manners and etiquette to a rather rough Scotland, shall we say. I'll be careful how I put that. And she was a great patron of the arts and of education. Now, we're going to leave Dunfermline for a moment, and it's not certain that there's no actual account of Mary going to Iona, but I wanted to take you there because it is a place that she supported, and it is crucial to understanding some of this Celtic monasticism that I've been referring to, and that Margaret really displaces to a great extent. She and Malcolm worked together to rebuild the Abbey of Iona. This is the most ancient Christian site, dating from 563, founded by St. Columba, who came across from Ireland with 12 companions. Now, Iona Abbey had been raided by the Vikings many times, such that it was in ruins, and Margaret and Malcolm set about restoring it and putting it back to a place of prominence. You can see that it's there just on the other coast of Scotland, so on the west side, just off what we know to be the Isle of Mull. And this donation is confirmed not just by Turgot, but by another document called the Odoric Vitalis, written by an English monk. It describes how, quote, "Among other things, she rebuilt the Abbey of Iona, and she gave the monks fitting revenues for the work of the Lord, and restored it." So you just go over the next page. This is what Iona looks like now. Sadly, no part of Iona, that complex of buildings that we can see, can be identified as coming from Margaret and Malcolm's time. The oldest part, which we see in the left-hand photograph, St. Oran's Chapel, for example, is thought to be the mid-12th century, so sometime after Margaret. Additionally, from the Viking raids and indeed the Reformation, no records from Iona survive. And yet, perhaps we can credit her with the fact that by the mid-12th century, we know that there was a thriving monastic community, and that was in large part due to the foundations of restoration that Margaret and Malcolm instituted. Here you can see how Iona was to suffer again later, sadly. These images show the after effects of the Scottish Reformation, when Calvinists and their iconoclastic bent desecrated and destroyed this great center of prayer and worship. And so There you can see it without a roof on for many, many years in the 18th century on the left, and even as recently as the late 19th century on the right. Happily, it's all been restored as the earlier images attest. Now let's go back to the Edinburgh Fife area. This is the Firth of Forth again. And this is, I want to show you Queen's Ferry. Now, clue is in the name. Margaret took care to promote pilgrimages, and the great pilgrim centre of the time was St. Andrews, where a relic of St. Andrews was held. She built shelters for pilgrims and established a ferry that would take pilgrims and other passengers across this body of river, the Firth of Forth, from Edinburgh on the south side, if you will, to Fife, Dunfermline, St. Andrews, etc. on the north side. The ferry left from the place we now know as Queen's Ferry, and also from North Berwick, further down the coast. There were two ferries. The best thing is that the ferries were free of charge, and it might also be assumed that Margaret herself used the ferry when going between Dunfermline and Edinburgh Castle. So I'm just showing you in a slightly wider angle that ferry crossing from Edinburgh to Dunfermline, just above in Fife. And right at the top, you see St. Andrews. I don't know if you can see that above where it says Fife, Scotland. That is St. Andrews up there. And here we see the expanse as it is now. So this is that same body of water, the Firth of Forth. And now, rather than a ferry, there are three bridges. The Forth Bridge, the Forth Road Bridge, and the Queen's Ferry crossing. The Scots, it seems, are not very inventive with names for bridges. And I might also mention that the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Gordon Brown, whom you might remember, he lives on the north side of Queen's Ferry, North Queen's Ferry, in that small village. So there's a reasonable chance if you come visit on another day, you'll bump into him in the post office or something. A former Prime Minister lives in that village. So we now move to the third and final part of the talk, a bit shorter than the others, you'll be pleased to know. The death, legacy, and sainthood. Okay, so St. Margaret is supposed to have died on the 16th of November, 1093, aged 47 at Edinburgh Castle. Turgot describes the death here. He refers to a son, who's probably Margaret's fourth son, Edgar. He later became King of the Scots. And the son is describing to her the battle against the English king, William Rufus. It's now the son of William the Conqueror. The matter that's being referred to is almost certainly the death of her husband and eldest son, Edward, at the Battle of Alnwick. And she died upon hearing the news of their death just 3 days after the event. So she was already unwell, but at the time, people attributed her death to grief. She was buried before the high altar in Dunfermline Abbey, which she had founded for this very purpose, you'll remember. Next slide. So that's her death. What of her legacy and popular memory? Well, her influence and wisdom undoubtedly contributed to more outward-looking, less isolated Scotland. Scotland really becomes part of Europe in the way that it never had. It was never part of the Roman Empire. It never really been absorbed into the greater milieu of Europe. It was at best a kind of a Viking, a place for Vikings to hang out and raid. It never really came into Europe, but Margaret changed that. That was hugely significant. But perhaps her greatest legacy, or one of her greatest legacies, was in her children. First and foremost amongst them, David, who was only 8 or 9 at the time of her death. David was much like his mother in the way he ruled. It's said that he struck a great balance between old and new. There was a great hagiographic eulogy written by Aelred of Rivaux, the guy that wrote Spiritual Friendship. I don't know if any of you had seen that, but he was thought to be a very holy man and a good ruler, but unlike his mother, was never canonized. He never became a saint, but was crucial for the future of Scotland. He also founded monastic abbeys, most notably the Abbey of Holyrood, and that is where the relic of the true cross that Margaret held on her deathbed and throughout her life was placed. Holyrood subsequently, as with so many of the things that we will see, and the reason we can't show you things is they were destroyed at the Reformation, but it's now a royal palace with a great park around it. I want to show you Edinburgh Castle. Now, Edinburgh Castle was not Margaret's principal residence, but a place that she visited. And it was David, her son, that built one of the many memorials to her. But the most fitting and the oldest was St. Margaret's Chapel, which is in the castle and stands on the highest point in all of Edinburgh, at the top of the castle rock, overlooking the city, overlooking the Firth of Forth to Fife, where we've been in Dunfermline, and a reminder to everyone of the example and prayers of our saintly patroness. And it's only half a mile from where I'm now sat, so I go there often. Next slide. Here we see it. This is it, inside the castle at the very top, St. Margaret's Chapel. Now, this was not a chapel that Margaret prayed in. It was built only after her death, but it is the oldest building in all of Edinburgh. The oldest building in the entire city, and the tallest as well. It's at the highest point. It's a very small oratory, perhaps seats 20 tops. So it's the oldest one, and it's remarkable because it's survived, unlike so many other buildings in Edinburgh, throughout wars and reformations, throughout the castle, the most besieged castle in all of the UK, not just Scotland. This castle has been through so many conflicts. 26 times the castle has been besieged and attacked. And throughout it all, this little chapel has survived. Now, this is just one. I mean, we could sit here all night or all afternoon and I could show you things named after St. Margaret, but this is one of my favorites, St. Margaret's Lock, which I go on a run past at least twice a week. And it's the most beautiful expanse of water at the bottom of Arthur's Seat, right in the heart of the city. It doesn't look like it, looks like you're in the Highlands. It's right in the heart of the city, named after St. Margaret. What an honor. Undoubtedly, a big part of her legacy is monasticism and religious life in Scotland. And I suppose myself, though not a Benedictine or a monk, I'm a Dominican friar, I have her in my debt. I'm in her debt, rather, for that, I would think. I've just chosen here to picture the Abbey of Pluskiddon, which is a flourishing Benedictine monastery in Elgin in the north of Scotland, which is our biggest monastic house in the country. And that story, of course, as I say, at least in the Roman sense in which we know monasticism, begins with Margaret.
You know, I'd like to interject something right here. I think some of our fellow pilgrims will find this very interesting. Richard, you may know this story. This is about Father Cassian Folsom, the Benedictine monk in Norcia, Italy. And when he was discerning whether or not to refound the Benedictine monastery in Norcia, Italy, it had been not there since 1810. So in the town where St. Benedict was born in Norcia, Italy, he was feeling a call to refound that monastery. And he spent some time discerning it, and he went here. And his purpose of going here was to discern it. And he walked into the sacristy, and there was right on the wall, right when he looked up, there was a painting of Norcia. And for him, that was the final affirmation that he received here to go back to Norcia and to refound that monastery.
Well, it's certainly a beautiful place, and it's quite a strict monastery. It's known for great observance. The former abbot of the monastery is now the Bishop of Aberdeen, the president of the Scottish Bishops' Conference, and in that kind of monk bishop mode is the greatest spiritual authority in the whole of the UK. And if you ever get the chance to read his sermons online, English, he's definitely one of the kind of mystic bishop leaders that we have, and not many people know of him. So how do
we find his sermons online?
You just Google Bishop Hugh Gilbert is his name.
Gilbert.
Yeah, he's elected as the president of the Bishops' Conference, even though there are two archbishops, because he is a bit of a spiritual master, and it comes from what he learns in the monastery, for sure, in this monastery, Pluskiddon.
And how long would it take you to get from Edinburgh to this monastery?
4 hours, exactly.
Is that train or
train or drive? Either way is 4 hours, both ways. But
and it's pretty far north, from what I understand, correct?
Yeah, it's near Aberdeen in Elgin, so it's right up towards the Highlands. We have some Dominican sisters. There's Dominican sisters from Nashville. They're also based in Elgin, so it's a place that I like to go. All right, let me press on, because we're not far from finishing. I don't want to take people's time. So she's known as the Pearl of Scotland. This woman, in popular memory of the country, is not just a Catholic saint, but is dearly loved as a Scot, even though, as I said at the start, and we've learned as we've retraced her footsteps, she's Scottish only by adoption. Next slide. Venerated as a saint. So the church in 1250 or 1249, a bit of confusion as to which of the two dates it is, Pope Innocent IV canonized Margaret, sorry. And it was 9 years later, on the 19th of June, 1259, that her body was translated, as they say, moved from its original burial site to somewhere more prominent so they could make a shrine. You see in the next slide, the illustration on the right is how the shrine would have looked. It's an artist's impression, a great shrine. And the photograph on the left is how it is now. And again, we have the Reformation to thank for that. But at the time of the translation, it was a great liturgical occasion. The reigning king, King Alexander III, was there, 7 bishops, all the nobles of Scotland. Now, centuries later, in 1560, when Mary, Queen of Scots, was about to go into labour, she requested that the head of Queen Margaret be brought to Edinburgh Castle to assist her in childbirth. Relics were believed to have had a great power in moments such as that. And so Margaret, who had had 8 children, she wanted to be close and have the intercession of the saint, and that was a way in which she did that. Of course, relics are still much an aid to prayer. Later that same year, the shrine was desecrated during the violent iconoclasm of the Scottish Reformation. Only the base that you can see there remains, and you can visit the site, but so much has been destroyed, sadly. In 1597, Margaret's skull, which remember Mary Queen of Scots has had removed, was taken to Europe for safekeeping and to France and put into the Scots College run by the Jesuits. It was kept there in a reliquary, but was later lost during the French Revolution. Moral of the story: don't trust the Jesuits. At least not with other people's skulls. Some of my best friends are Jesuits. I'm joking. So King Philip of Spain is said to have taken the other remains of Margaret and Malcolm and put them into the Escorial Palace in Madrid in Spain. But when in the 19th century, a bishop of Edinburgh asked for the remains to come back because it was safe, the first time that Catholics were allowed to worship and practice in Scotland, they had been lost. And Pius IX was nonplussed. They could not be found. So we don't know where the rest of the bodies of Margaret and Malcolm are now. However, happily, there is an extant relic, and that is housed in Dunfermline in the Scottish Catholic Church, which was on the last slide. It's a portion of her shoulder. And there's also another relic in Hungary that I've read about. The church named her as patron saint of Scotland in 1673. Her feast day is on the 16th of November. It's probably an optional memorial in the US, I'm not entirely sure. And every year there is a pilgrimage in her honor. And here are a couple of photos of the pilgrimage with the relic being led by the Archbishop of St. Andrews in Edinburgh, Archbishop Leo Cushley. So if you don't mind, I'd just like to finish with a closing prayer to this great woman. O God, who made St. Margaret of Scotland wonderful in her outstanding charity towards the poor, grant that through her intercession and example, we may reflect among all humanity the image of your goodness. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. Amen.